welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari and today is my lightning round wrap up for October. Two little housekeeping things before I get into this. First, you probably have not seen a TBR video for the month of November. That's because I don't know what books I'm reading for November yet. I always read Goodreads Choice Awards, and last year and the year before they both announced, or the Goodreads Choice nominations announced at the end of October, and it is November 1st when I'm recording this and I still don't have an announcement. So I'm still waiting for that. The day that that comes up, I will record a video and probably put it up that day. I just don't know what's on my November TBR until that happens. The second thing is, I learned that working retail and trying to read books and my normal pattern does not work well together. Like, I never read books in my previous desk job while I was working. Like, never. But I could still read 20 plus books a month. This month I barely got through 12 because I was just so exhausted the moment I got home that I just didn't even have the energy to read. I just fell asleep. So a very, very, very small stack this month. So this video should probably go pretty quickly. So let's start out with the stats like normal. This month I read 12 books, a total of 4,263 pages, which is my lowest month of the whole year so far. Average pages per day was 138 pages per day, and average page per book was 355 pages per book. So I did read a couple of long books. Still a very slow month. Out of those, the genres were 4 of them were fantasy, 2 sci-fi, 2 general fiction, 2 horror, 1 thriller, and 1 graphic novel. The authors' genders were split evenly. I read 6 books by men, 6 books by women. Demographic, 7 of them were for adults, 5 were for young adults, which is a lot higher on the young adult side than I normally read, which could account for kind of the low ratings that I gave some of them. Format, 8 of them were physical books, 3 ebooks and 1 audiobook. Source, 6 of them were books that I had purchased this year. 3 of them were backlist books and 3 of them were ARCs. I can tell you right now that I hauled way more books than I read this month, so the haul video will be coming on Saturday if you want to check that out. It's a big stack. I failed my mini game of reading more than I haul. Oops. Star ratings. I actually gave 2 of these books 5 stars. 3 of them got 4 stars, 5 3 stars, 1 2 star, 1 1 star, and 1 DNF. So let's get into the books that I read. I'm gonna go in order, and if I read any of these for my TBR games, I will mention it in this video. I usually do it in my TBR, but since the TBR is not out, I'll do it in this one. The first book I read this month was The Wife Upstairs by Rachel Hawkins. This was a thriller, and it was on my TBR from my Dungeon of Books TBR games as a thriller. This is a modern thriller retelling of Jane Eyre, and the fact that I've read Jane Eyre and knew this was a Jane Eyre retelling made it very, very easy to guess the plot twist because it's based on an existing book. I didn't like this, but I don't seem to like thrillers very much, so maybe somebody who does like thrillers would like this a whole lot more than I did. I think I gave this a 3 star because it was fine, it just wasn't good. After that, I ended up driving up to visit my dad, which is about a 3-hour drive, and I was listening to an audiobook while I was driving, and I listened to Raybearer, which is a book by Jordan Fueko that I've had since it came out, just never really got around to listening to it. I did get this as part of the influencer program for Libro FM, and yeah, I listened to it. It was good. I enjoyed this a lot. I knew that I would like it, but I think I kept putting it off because it's young adult, and I struggle with young adult. It's either like really good, or more often it's like this would have been a good story if it wasn't told in a young adult format. So I like this. I recommend it. I am looking forward to the next book in the series, and I gave it 4 stars. The next 3 books were my ARCs for the month, starting with Trailer Park Trickster by David Slayton. I gave this one 4 stars. This is a continuation of his series that started with White Trash Warlock, which I read as an ARC last year as a joke, thinking that it was going to be bad, but it turned out really, really good, and I love the series. If you like a marshmallow protagonist who cares more about other people than anything else, and even though he's not particularly powerful, his passion is saving people, doing what he can, then I think you'll really like this series. It's also very queer, so highly recommend. Next, I read Tales from the Cafe by Toshikawa Kawazuki, I think is how you say his name. Kawaguchi. Sorry, Toshikawa Kawaguchi. And this is the second book in, or I guess it's a continuation of Before the Coffee Gets Cold. Like Before the Coffee Gets Cold, this is 4 short stories set in this Japanese cafe where you can time travel. But time travel is so restrictive that almost no one does it. I ended up giving this 5 stars. I liked it more than Before the Coffee Gets Cold because I didn't like the first story in Before the Coffee Gets Cold, but I liked all 4 stories in this book. So highly recommend it. Highly recommend the first book. Yeah, it's fun. It's a fun look at sci-fi from a non-Western perspective. Highly recommend. Then after that I read Within These Wicked Walls by Lauren Blackwood. This obviously was another ARC that I had picked up. This one, everything about the premise sounded exactly what I wanted from the book, but it was a young adult title. So I was like waffling back and forth going like, do I want to read this because the premise sounds so perfect, but I'm afraid what's going to happen with it because it's a young adult title. And basically everything that I was worried about kinda happened. Like the premise was so cool. Like the idea of this book was so cool. The execution just wasn't there for me because of like some of the really, really stupid young adult tropes that were found in this book. Like insta love. I hated the male love interest character. The resolution to some things just didn't make sense. Like the plot holes everywhere. just everywhere with the plot holes, or just other things that didn't make sense. This one just wasn't really for me, but if you tend to really enjoy young adult, I think you'll like this. You just have to really, really like young adult. Next up was another book for my TBR game where I read a horror book, and this one a friend picked for me, which was War Moo by Michael Logan. There was a lot of problems with this. First off, this genre of book, this is like a book series based off 80s apocalypse movies. So that wasn't really my thing. Second, this is the second book in the series, which honestly, like I didn't have any problems understanding what was going on not having read the first book. It's pretty straightforward, like what happened in the first book, and it's like roughly revisited, so you could easily read this without reading the first book. But other than like the genre wasn't really for me. Technically this is the second book in the series, and there's no cows. I don't know if Apocalypse Cow, which is the first book in the series, actually does this better with like actually including the cows. It's like a major plot point. I don't think it does. I think they're as briefly mentioned in the first book as they are in this one. But I was led to believe by the cover of this book that this was about zombie cows, and it's not really about zombie cows. So, disappointment, but I'm not super surprised I didn't like it. Next up, another book from my TBR for this month, and this prompt was actually like a picked for me prompt. Same person who picked out War Moo picked this one, but this was the actual picked for me prompt. And this is The Fifth Wave by Rick Yancey. This is a young adult dystopian, right? And I actually like young adult dystopians. I don't tend to like young adult fantasy, but I like young adult dystopians. And this one is one of those, like, if you were in the big craze of like the 2010s for young adult dystopian novels and you really, really like that format, you'll like this book, because this is like the most generic young adult dystopian ever. But I love that format. I love that genre. So I enjoyed this a lot. I think I gave it 4 stars. But I could understand a lot of people not really caring for this book because it is exactly like every other 2010s young adult dystopian. Like any young adult dystopian novel you read in 2016, this is the same novel as you've already read. But like I said, I did like it. I plan to continue on with the series, and yeah, I think that basically covers that. Next up, from my TBR, was my Jar of Doom pick, because I rolled a 1, and that was Good Guys by Stephen Brust. This is kind of hard to explain. Kind of like superheroes, but it's like magic exists, and then this is like underpaid staff on a policing force trying to solve a murder mystery of like these magical means being used to kill corrupt magic users. If that makes sense at all, it doesn't really. My problem with this book is this has a black main character, but it was written by a white man. And although you can tell that the author very much wants to support Black lives and is probably means well with this, he is not black and he doesn't understand the black experience, and so a lot of the way he writes his main character is stereotypical instead of like actual like black experience. So you could tell that he's trying, but he just kind of misses the mark somewhere in there. This I got from a book box. Obviously didn't want to read it. The premise, like the very first premise of it is Donovan was shot by a cop for jaywalking, supposedly, actually for arguing with a cop while black. 4 of the 9 shots were lethal, or would have been if their target had been anyone else. The Foundation picked him up, brought him back, and trained him. Lethal turns out to be a relative term when magic's involved. That has fuck all to do with the plot. If I hadn't have read that in the synopsis right here, I would have never known that that existed at all. Like that's not part of the book at all. This is years and years later and doesn't involve him being shot by a cop at all. The other thing that really bothers me about it is Donovan, the main character. Every time he talks, he says police, like capital P, capital O dash LICE. And so you know it's him talking because he has to pronounce police like he's black or something like that. It's ridiculous. This also has like a bajillion perspectives and they're not needed at all. Like, get rid of all of these extra perspectives. It's confusing, unnecessary. The characters aren't fleshed out enough to really tell the difference between all the different perspectives. So don't recommend this one, but it wasn't the worst thing in the world I read. Next up, one of the chunky boys I read, Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth. I ended up with the American version, but I really wanted the European cover for this because I'll put it up here. The European cover for this is so pretty. I want it so bad. Unfortunately, I'm probably not going to buy it because I didn't like this book. I'm not sure what the F was the point of this book. The plot is non-existent. I could tell, like, this entire story, like the plot of this book, could be told in a short story. And I think that short story would be very good. But putting this in like a 700 page, no, it's like a 600 page book. It did not need to be a 600 page book. Yeah, that's really all I'm going to get into about this. It doesn't really have a plot. If you just want to read a character study of a bunch of different lesbian women who have very, very unfortunate circumstances, sure. If you want plot, don't pick this up. Next up from my TBR, again, a book from the Goodreads Choice Awards, which was 2020 Goodreads Choice Awards final month for it as far as my TBR game is concerned, and for that I picked up The Relentless Moon by Mary Robinette Kowal. This was in the sci-fi section, and this has been nominated for like a lot of awards, so I have been reading this series over the, you know, process of this year. This is the most recent book that came out. The Lady Astronaut series, the first two books followed a lady astronaut named Elma. In like the 1950s, a comet hits the eastern seaboard, and in the first book they're trying to get to the moon for the first time, because this is before the actual moon launch, because this comet is a apocalyptic event. Over time it's going to heat up the atmosphere, so Earth is not livable, but they've got like so many, like 13-20 years or so to actually colonize the moon or colonize Mars. The first book is them trying to get to the moon for the first time, and it's mostly about women trying to gain rights to become astronauts alongside the men, because if you're going to recolonize the world, you can't just send men to the moon. They can't have babies. So then the second book, she is on her trip, on her way to Mars, and I did not like the second book. I really liked the first book, didn't like the second book. This one takes place at the same time that Elma is traveling to Mars, but this follows the moon colony and another female astronaut named Nicole Morgan, who is the wife of a senator. Highly recommend this series, and I guess that's it. After that, I read my book club book for the book covered book club this month, which the prompt for that was a book with teal on the cover. Paper Girls Volume 3 is what I read. This is the third volume in a graphic novel series. I still can't figure out what the hell this graphic novel series is about, but I think I'm at the point where I'm actually starting to like it, even though I have no idea what's going on other than some form of time, I think time travel. It might not be time travel, it could be like different dimensions, but it's weird, but I think I'm starting to like it. And that's pretty much all I have to say about this one. The final book that I actually read this month was a total wash, which was Witches of Ash and Ruin. Now, I read this one for a couple of different reasons. First, for Books and Lala's buzzword prompts for the year. It was to elements this year, so ash is what I use for my element term. It's kind of a stretch. There's elemental magic in here too, so it did end up working, but a little bit of a stretch, but that's what I read it for. Also, for the character creation for the magical readathon, I think is what it's called, by G from Book Roast. The character race, I needed to read a book with a crow on the cover or a red cover. In this, I think that's a raven, but we're gonna pretend like it's a crow, and it's definitely red. So even though I hated it, I finished it so I could fill that prompt, and I ended up giving this 1 star. This is awful. There are 4 perspectives. You only really need 1 perspective, maybe 2. The main character supposedly has OCD. I can't speak to the rep, but I don't think it's good because most of the time there was no knowledge of her having OCD, and the character herself was just like the most useless person. She's supposed to be like a powerful witch, but she never casted a spell the entire time. Because in any sort of like scary or situation where she needed magic to protect herself, she just kind of froze. Or she just didn't know the spell. It's like, how are you a witch and your best friend who ascended at the same time as you did knows all of these spells, but you don't know any of them. Also, she's supposed to have like a reverend for a father in like a really overly religious town, which we're told like all the time, like how religious and strict this town and her father is, but it was never, like this never came into play at any point during the book. So it's very much told but never shown. Nothing about her father or him being a reverend or the religiousness of this town ever affected her ability to be a witch, and just didn't seem to have a point in the plot. One of the perspectives we read from is the bad guy, and let me tell you, most authors can't write bad guys. This one is absolutely no exception, and you really, really shouldn't ever write a perspective from a bad guy, because it just makes them not as intimidating or scary. And this one was particularly like, I wasn't even sure, like the motives didn't make any sense, and the perspectives from, or trying to figure out, his motive made sense, but the reason that we had him as a perspective character didn't make sense. There was a character named Samuel, who's the main character's ex-boyfriend, who his perspective was never needed. His entire plot line could have been removed from the story and it wouldn't have made an iota of difference to the story overall. And then we had the new love interest, which I can't, it was another witch named Meaner, I think is her name, which, you know what, her name is accurate because she is an awful character and she's supposed to be the new love interest, but there is no, like, you couldn't tell why they liked each other. There's no chemistry. There's no reason for any of their attraction other than they see each other and they like instantly fall in love. And then everything about this character was like super red flag. She was super abusive, both physically and emotionally. She was violent. She had like a hair trigger. It's like, this is not like, you want to make a lesbian love story, cool. Maybe don't make the character abusive. And then we have perspectives from her talking about like why she's so abusive and angry all the time, and none of it makes sense. It's like, yes, you had a bad childhood, but that doesn't give you the excuse to behave violently towards other people, if that makes sense. So yeah, I hated this. I gave it 1 star. I don't recommend it. The last book on this list is my DNF for the month, which was Defending a Serial Killer. I don't remember who it's by. I DNF'd this one very, very quickly into the book. I did have this as an arc from Edelweiss, and it was nonfiction about a serial killer written by a older man who was like a new lawyer or a law student or something like that, back in the 60s. And this was his first trial, is trying to defend a serial killer. And the idea behind the book was supposed to be like, how do you defend somebody who you know has done horrible things? Like, how do you defend the undefendable? And it's just follow the letter of the law. Like, what does the law say? Do that. But most of the time he spent talking about how the serial killer was potentially trans and liked to wear women's clothes, and waxed poetically about somehow him wearing women's clothes made him a serial killer, which doesn't make any sense. Being trans or wearing women's clothes does not make you a serial killer. It has fuck all to do with being a serial killer. Half the population wears women's clothes every day. They're called women. And women are a lot less likely to be serial killers than men. So if we're gonna go with that argument, wearing women's clothes makes you less likely to be a serial killer than wearing women's clothes. But there's no correlation between the clothes you wear and you being a serial killer or being transgendered and being a serial killer. So the whole thing was just ridiculous and harmful to the trans community, and it was bullshit, and the author should be ashamed of himself, and I have nothing more to say about that book because it was fucking awful. But yes, that is my tiny stack of books that I read this month. Let me know what you think about any of these in the description below, or let me know what you think about any of these in the comments below. I will see you in the next video, which I hope is going to be a TBR. Okay, bye.